What up, everybody? Hopefully, you guys are having a wonderful evening on this Friday Eve. This is a live show of the About That Wallet podcast where I typically do this so I can reach out to you all as my listeners and try to get this one on one conversation going. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is about labor unions. Ah, man, this is going to be a wild one. So make sure you got your popcorn. We're going to be doing some deep dives and some longer conversations. So, going to get this intro and then we'll be right back. What up? What up? What up? So, one of the things I'm gonna just start off with this one because I actually do like The Simpsons. They always got information on everything, and I had to say one of my favorite characters is Mr. Burns, and this is what he has to say about unions. 'Cause that's what we're talking about. So let's go on and kick it off. See what he got to say.
Smithers, where's that union representative? He's 20 minutes late.
I don't know, sir. He hasn't been seen since he promised to clean up the union.
Whoa! What the hell? Well, let's look at the contract ourselves, eh? Benefits, perks, a green cookie on St. Patrick's Day. Oh, it didn't used to be this way, Smithers. No, it didn't used to be this way at all. Come on, crack those atoms. You, turn out those pockets. Atoms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of them. Take him away.
You can't treat the working man this way. One day we'll form a union and get the fair and equitable treatment we deserve. Then we'll go too far and get corrupt and shiftless. And the Japanese will eat us alive.
The Japanese? Those sandal-wearing goldfish tenders? Bosh, Flimshaw. If only we had listened to that boy instead of walling him up in the abandoned coke oven. Well, I am going to avenge my grandfather. We'll take on that greedy union.
Yeah. So, I mean, oh man. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about unions is because unions is one of those things that a lot of people you hear about often, but you don't really take a deep dive into. And you hear about strikes that are happening, and I always think about it, it's like, why do people even sign up for unions? Where do they come from? Like, what sparked people to say, you know what? I'm tired of working these wages. I want to rise up against the big guy, the person that writes my check. And I really think it's unfair on how they operating. Instead of just quitting altogether and just saying, you know what? I'm through with this. But I'm gonna just take you back in time a little bit because see if I play some tunes here to kind of keep you guys entertained as I follow through some of this stuff. Because one of the things about unions that I noticed that they do cover a lot of stuff. You'd be surprised. They cover anything from childcare. You just recently heard about the workers who were working on the Key Bridge that was struck by a ship. I want to say a carrier ship. And because the workers were part of a union, even though the ones that passed away, their children are actually covered through education. And I believe it was 4 workers that passed away, but one of the workers actually had like 4 or 5 children. And because he had 4 or 5 children, all of those children are actually taken care of from the education standpoint based on the union. So you'd be like, well, Anthony, where did the first union come from? I'm glad you asked because I was asking the same question when I was doing my research. And I was like, well, what the heck is it? So I did some research, and this is coming from pbs.org For those of you who don't know what PBS stands for, I think it stands for the Public Broadcasting System. So it's for everybody. And they say the first union date back in the 18th century. For those of you who are not familiar with how the centuries are working out, it's like how we are in the 21st century, which means that it's usually, think about it like a year, the thousands of years before. So as they say in the 18th century, usually you're talking about the 1700s. And they saying it started back then. They said the first union in the United States was, they got a misprint, was the Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers, Leather Workers, and Cobblers, founded in 1794. However, by 1806, requests for wage increase caused factory workers to sue on a charge of criminal conspiracy. Ooh, so I don't have any. So this is the type of music they used to listen to, I guess. I don't know. Big bands, horns and everything. So in 1806, requests for wage increase caused factory workers to sue on a charge of criminal conspiracy, as a labor union law had not been formally established. The court ruled in favor of the owners. The society was bankrupt, and any union member could be charged with conspiracy until 1842, which ruled otherwise. Then the government continued to support companies over trade unions. So in 1894, there were 250,000 workers in the Pullman Railroad line organized a strike to protest wage treatment. But President Grover Cleveland responded with sending federal troops to prevent the strikes from obstructing the trains, and fights broke out between the soldiers and the strikers. After dozens of deaths, the army subdued the strikes and ended the strike, with the American Railway Union dissolving as the leaders were arrested and ignoring the anti-strike federal injunction. So this is really key important information here, because it goes to show that how even though the workers might have been in the right, it still looked as though the government was still funding and supporting the independent companies, which is interesting. So in 1914, they saw even deadlier strike, which means that the Colorado, and this is the image here that you guys are seeing are from the Library of Congress. For those of you who are listening to the audio side of the house, this is strictly looked like everything was demolished and just people walking around in rubble. So it's really horrible. I know I'm playing upbeat music on this horrible situation, but that's what I got for right now. So they said the Colorado coal miners in Ludlow, Colorado, went on strike against the poor working conditions in 1913, with 1,200 of them living in the tent city. In April 1914, the Colorado National Guard and guards hired by the mining companies attacked the tent city, killing 21 inhabitants. Now, this is really interesting because right now the National Guard is controlled by the states, not by the individual companies. So this is interesting to see how the laws have changed from back then to now. So because of that conflict that continued until the arrival of federal troops, with miners attacking back, became known as the Colorado Coal Field War, with estimates of deaths of 69 and 199. The strike ended in December of 1914, with no concessions made to the workers. So that means that they've been fighting since April to December. So you're looking at the flowers are blooming, springtime is here, all the way up until it's cold and shivering again. So everything concluded for them to stop going back to work. Now, this is also interesting on how the president was like, hold up. This is different here. He started looking at things a little differently. Instead of supporting the companies as they were in the past, he was like, I'm on the side of the workers. I think it's their time. I think it's their time to rise up. And he was like, you know what? During the Great Depression and the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, unions gained more government support than they had in the past. And with the National Labor Relations Act ensuring the right for workers to organize into unions and the Fair Labor Standards Act guaranteeing a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and the end of child labor. Future executive orders, they usually, if you're in the government, they usually call them EOs or E.Os for executive orders, from John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, would expand the further act to include unions and federal workers. So this is really key importance because I want to talk about this just a little bit. Because remember, this is during a time frame where a lot of people were depressed. They had nothing else to live for. You know, the stock market went down, and people were just kind of upset about it. But this also got me thinking of, well, if this was all that so important, then what was really going on around that time frame that caused people to start changing their minds? So I went to the History Channel, as everyone does, and I was looking at the discrimination against the labor movement. So, according to history.com, if you guys want to look it up yourselves, it's history.com /topics /19th dash century. And they talk about the discrimination in the labor movement. As sweeping technical change began to undermine the craft system of production, some national unions did move toward the industrial structure, was notably in coal mining and garment trades. But most craft unions either refused or, as in iron and steel and meat packaging, failed to organize the less skilled. That is interesting because for those of you who know that we are moving to a classless society, which means that this classless society are the people who don't work, who usually have a hard time trying to find skills or anything beyond the physical labor. And then you're also looking at those who are going into the arts. But how are you actually moving society forward as we have AI coming forward? So then it was like in 1895, they were unable to launch the interracial mechanist machinist union of its own. The Federation reversed an early principled decision and chartered the whites only International Association of Machinists. Formally or informally, the color bar thereafter spread throughout the trade union movement. In 1902, blacks made up scarcely 3% of the total membership, most of them segregated in Jim Crow locals. In the case of women in Eastern European immigrants, I'm sure you guys were wondering, is that a similar divulsion occurred, welcomed by equals in theory, excluded or segregated in practice. Only the fate of Asian workers was unproblematic. Their rights had not been asserted by the AFL in the first place. So keep in mind, this was also during a time frame where Asian immigrants were coming over and they were actually put inside concentration camps doing, I believe this was during Pearl Harbor, but it's still afterwards, and people still feel some kind of way about how things were happening during the Pearl Harbor era and so forth. So, but let's get back to this. because this is really interesting stuff. Like I didn't know that, people was like, you know what? Hold up. I'm up here working all this time and I don't get anything for it. And yet, because I want to decide not to work and I tell my friends, like, hey, we should get paid a little better. The company will go out and hire the National Guards to come and just start shooting up the place. That's ridiculous. I'm so glad that, JFK, John F. Kennedy, and also Nixon kind of decided to expand and actually start backing the workers, because this is really important to kind of think of. Now, oh my gosh, gotta love these ads. It's not even related to the topic. So now we're getting up to
During his first 100 days in
I'm gonna play this little clip here. This is directly from their website so that we all can hear what they had to say. It's just a 2-minute video. So let's see what they got.
office, FDR pushed an unprecedented. During his first 100 days in office, FDR pushed an unprecedented slate of legislation through Congress to fight the Depression. This was the start of the New Deal.
The New Deal is a series of initiatives that imparted a much greater degree of security and safety and stability to American life in all kinds of sectors, in the banking sector, investment sector, home building, home owning sectors, employment, and so on.
Franklin Roosevelt had a great political partner in the New Deal, his First Lady. The crippling effects of the president's polio made Eleanor indispensable to him.
She could be his eyes and his ears and his legs, and she could tour the country, and she could reach out to people, and then she could bring the country back to him. She was always pushing the New Deal and him to do more in terms of social welfare and helping Americans. And I think that in many ways, we can really see her as the conscience of the New Deal.
The New Deal expanded beyond those first 100 days. In 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act, creating a safety net for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed. Despite the passage of the Social Security Act, FDR's New Deal didn't put an end to the Depression. It would take the industrial mobilization of World War II to achieve that goal.
In a sense, he didn't succeed any better than Herbert Hoover did economically. Where Roosevelt succeeded was in exuding public confidence, making the Depression more palatable to people, giving people the impression that he really was doing something, that he really cared.
So I think that's really important to see that, the presidents made a big deal when it came to the labor unions, the reason why we have them, and the importance of why we keep them today. Now, we have to think about it as a collective. The whole point of having a union is that you want to be able to come together and bargain for your fair share in the company. And some people might not like that. But if this not against the law, they're not breaking any laws. They come into you humbly. Now, they might break a leg or two. I mean, that's how it started with the mob, but we ain't going to go down that route. We trying to keep it all together here. What was really going on? So, this is what they were doing. Okay. So there is I believe there's one of those unions. I think it's called the AFL-CIO. And I'm trying to figure out where they put it at because they don't spell it out here. Let me look it up right quick. But it's one of the largest unions that is out there. Say AFL-CIO. And it stands for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. So that actually is one of the biggest unions that is in the United States right now. I believe it has about 7 million union members. So the formation of the AFL-CIO in 1955 visibly testified the power to the powerful communities, continuities persisting through the age of industrial unionism. Ugh, I cannot speak today. You guys, like, I'm glad this is live because y'all can see this, because usually I edit all of this out. But here we go. Above all, the central purpose remained what it had always been: to advance the economic and job interests of the union membership. Collective bargaining performed impressively in the World War II, more than tripling weekly earnings in manufacturing between 1945 and 1970, gaining for the union workers an unprecedented measure of security against old age, illness, and unemployment, and through contractual protections, greatly strengthening their right to fair treatment of the workplace. So if you guys are thinking about like how you can get hurt on a job and then you just fall down and all of a sudden you get in workers' comp, that is part of the union. If you're complaining about like, hey, I only get about 3 days or a week or even 2 weeks or just 0 days. I think in the US, there is no law that requires you to have time off for having a baby. So for the women out there that just want to have a baby and get jobs like, well, I expect you to come back that next day. They're not against the law. It's just the way how things are written until we have unions that actually fight on your behalf. Because the companies, these big companies, they have lobbyists that come in every day to make this happen. Now, I'm not saying like this is for a fact, but remember, I'm just here to educate you. And this is for education purposes only. And some people might say this is for entertainment. So if you're here for the entertainment, by all means, enjoy it. But I want you to start thinking about this. So now we're getting into the fun part of it. But before we do that, I want to go ahead on and move things over. I think I got like a little small trivia. I'm actually trying things out. I didn't add my music yet. So bear with me here. I have a little trivia for you all. And I'm going to read it before we go to commercial that I created for this. Let me see if I get some catchy music, because I got to add the music to it later. When I do that, it'll be for the next live. I actually just created this, so pay me no mind. All right, so here we go. So trivia time. What is the trivia for today? The trivia is, what age do people start building their wages? 15 to 20, 21 to 25, or 25 to 30? Let me know what you guys think and listen to this commercial coming up, and be right back. You're listening to the About That Water podcast. We'll be right back after these messages. You're listening to the About That Water podcast. We'll be right back after these messages.
Even the best and the brightest this world has to offer have coaches and mentors. Build strong money-making behaviors by applying financial concepts and strategies with Anthony Weaver on the About That Wallet Show. It's time to get off the bench and get in the game. Now, here's your host, Anthony Weaver.
All right, so you're trying to figure out what is the answer to that quiz. The answer is 21 to 25. If you got that right, go ahead on and give yourself a round of applause because you got the answer right. If I can get my applause. All right. Congrats to you if you got that right. So, back to the show. All right. One of the things is that we discussed is when you start talking about unions and everything like that, you be like, okay, well, what about the minorities? Pretty much anybody that's not white at the time, and also the women, because back then women didn't have rights. Some people still say that they don't have rights. And then also you got to look into even changing your last name, getting married. Women couldn't have anything, so the reason why they were getting married, pawned it off, got the last name so they can actually buy a home or they can own something. But usually women were not allowed to own anything. So this is going to be interesting to see how they actually played a big part inside the union process. So they say this is again history. You gotta love history.com, man. They provide everything. It's great. But they didn't go as deep as I thought they would, but I do have other links in here. So they say nothing better captures an uneasy amalgam, I guess is how you say it, of an old and new and post-war labor movement than the treatment of minorities and women who flocked in initially from the mass production industries, but after the 1960s from the public and service sectors as well. Labor's historic commitment to racial and gender equality was thereby much strengthened, but not to the point of challenging the status quo within the labor movement itself. Thus, the leadership structure remained largely closed to minorities and did the skilled jobs that were historically and preserved for white male workers, notoriously so in the construction trades, but in the industry union as well. Yet for the AFL, which is one of the biggest ones, they said a crucial role in the battle for civil rights legislation in the 1964, 1965. 1965 is a time when I believe that is when Dr. King was assassinated around that time frame. I think a lot of stuff happened in 1965. Do I got my timelines wrong? When was King assassinated? I'm sorry, you guys, for the long pause. Oh, he was assassinated in 68. I'm sorry. So I'll take that back. Okay, so just 3 years later. All right, anyway, I'm going to read this again. So yet the AFL and the AFL-CIO played a crucial role in the battle of civil rights legislation in 1965, 1964. That was the legislation might be directed against the discriminatory trade union practices was anticipated and quietly welcomed by more progressive labor leaders, but more significantly than the meaning they found in the championing this kind of reform. Now that's really interesting to see how laborers were actually pushing for this, but a lot of them were still not for it. So it's like, well, why? Like it doesn't give you that why factor in this. And this is one of the reasons why I had to go to so many different sources to try to find how things were working out. Because remember in 1965, that was just mentioned. Where am I? Talking about the legislation for civil rights. During that time frame, I was looking up what are the biggest impacts of the labor unions as far as the biggest strikes. There was one strike that happened in the spring of 1966. A small group of California farm workers that were supported captured the attention of the nation. So remember, we just talked about it in the history side of the house that they were talking about the civil rights movements between legislation for 64, 65. So then just a year later, you have this huge strike where they saying in the morning of March 19, on the morning of March 17th, 1966, nearly 100 striking farm workers, most of them Mexican American and Filipino, set on foot from a small town, Delino, bound for the capital of Sacramento, roughly 300 miles to the north. As they passed through a dusty highways and farming communities on the Central Valley, they were joined by student activists, union organizers, civil rights workers, and members of the clergy, all drawn to the remote regions of California in support of the farm worker struggle. So because during this time frame, you have so many struggles across the United States to either A, integrate the workforce, but also you're looking at fair wages at the same time. Now, keep in mind, this is obviously post-war era, so people are kind of settling in. But because everybody's settling in, you're looking at when the boomers are coming through. So they making babies. And because they making babies, they got a lot of mouths to feed. So with that, oh man, I see that I'm starting to cut off on here. Let me see if I can. There we go. So they said for 6 months, farm workers had been on strike. They refused to harvest grapes in the vineyards around Delano until the growers met their demands for higher pay, safer work conditions, and recognitions of their unions. So remember, we were talking about earlier is that a lot of these companies were not recognizing these unions and were calling on the state to kind of help provide physical like manpower to kind of either kill these workers so they can get back to work, or are they going to continue on doing it this way? So because they didn't get their demands or even being recognized, the National Farm Workers Association, or NFWA, and the Agricultural Workers Organization Committee, or the AWOC. And so they continued that march, but they say here, the 1966 Farm Worker March was not only part of the farm worker struggle for justice, it was a key moment in the civil rights struggle in the 1960s. The farm workers who marched in the Delano to Sacramento represented a large seasonal labor force comprised overwhelming of people of color, whose labor made California's thriving agricultural industry possible. Although their labor produced fortunes from the soil, they were subject to poor wages and poor working conditions. This seems to be a repeating process since the 60s. We're still here in the 21st century, and we still having these discussions about this. So, like, what in the world is really going on? Are people actually paying attention to these unions, or to the people that are actually out here fighting for everyday people like you and I to have fair wages, have fair working conditions, and have the ability to support our families? Now, this is something that's really interesting to see. And that's the reason why I was looking up unions, because I was like, I hear about it, but what is the significance of them, and what makes them so impactful, and why people care about them? So let me finish this last paragraph here. They say farm workers also experience a legal and illegal discrimination. In the farmer movement, like the broader civil rights movement, economic inequality and social injustice went hand in hand. By forging a unique coalition of labor, civil rights, and religious leaders, farm workers successfully overcame the enticed power structures of the California agriculture. Their movement challenged some of the most powerful people and corporations in the state, demonstrating a remarkable resilience and ingenuity on the path of the Delano to Sacramento. Read the short essays below, blah, blah, for historical reference. So this shows that, they were fighting for this, but a lot of people were not taking them seriously. And so when you're not taken seriously, sometimes you have to sit out a little longer. You have to do what they say, like the boycotts. You have to go on strikes. You have to, separate yourself from the situation. Either A, do you continue on to deal with it or not? So, and that got me thinking of like, okay, well, if that was one of the big strikes, well, what are the things that are happening that everybody is like really looking forward to? And why is it such a hard thing to deal with? Because you'll think you'll have the human decency, like, yeah, these companies have all this money, but it's like, are we not viable, or are we not good enough? You know, like, do we make a point for anything? You know, I'm just curious about it myself, and it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't sit right with me on what's going on. So I started thinking about, well, what are the biggest strikes in history? Let me share this out. So for those of you who are listening on audio, I pulled up a image on Investopedia, talk about the biggest strikes in US history. So it goes as far back as the 1886, which is a Great Road Strike. Then we have 1894, the Pullman Strike. 1902, the Great Anthracite Coal Strike. 1919, the Steel Strike. 1922, the Railroad Workers Strike. 1934, the Textile Workers Strike. 1946, United Mine Workers of America. 1954, the Steel Strike of 1959. 1970, the U.S. Postal Strike. 1997, the the UPS Workers Strike. Now I remember when UPS, because I was born around that time frame. Because I remember when UPS went on strike. That was interesting to see how they just line the roads up with the brown trucks and everything like that, so they can get their fair wages. And I thought that was interesting that they, I'm glad that they took a stance on their mission, because they want to help out that fellow worker on this process. So as we coming up to looking at the big ones, and I was like, well, because they're so big, they provided so much value. Where else can I get some more information on this? So I was looking at the U.S. history page, which I think is called the LLC, the Library of Congress, because remember, the Library of Congress helps out with a lot of this stuff. And they depict a picture here from the CIO pickets. Let's see if I can blow this image up here. Oh yeah, I can. And it's just basically the women saying they want more money means better living conditions. We want a contract. And this is for the women fighting for their rights in Georgia, Greensboro. And it's actually interesting to see how that works. Let's see. I'm gonna skip through because he's going back in the past. Like I'm jumping around timelines here, but I want you to see like back in the New Deal, which was in the 1930s, when they were talking about, laborers, and President Roosevelt was actually backing a lot of this stuff. You have the union movement, which failed in the previous 50 years, because remember we talked about it in the very first one, was it 1895? That in the past 50 years, organized a much larger number of laborers, such mass production industries, as we talked about steel, textiles, mining, and automobiles, because this was around when I think Ford and GM were battling and stuff like that. So the steel mills were very popular back then as well. Like in Maryland, I think there's Bethlehem Steel, which is one of the biggest steel mills in Maryland. If you ever want to come by to Maryland, check it out. It's a pretty cool historical site. If you haven't, it's okay. But yeah, so they take it like that. These, rather than the skilled crafts, were to be the major growth industries of the first half of the 20th century. Now, keep in mind, these were the crafts that were needed back then. Currently, you're looking at how the industry has changed, where a lot of people only doing working on their computers or working from home, and not too many people nowadays are actually willing to do the hard stuff. So these unions have to rise up. So it's interesting to see the shift on where the money goes. But let's continue on here. What they say here with the Library of Congress, they say, although the future of the labor unions looked grim in 1933, their fortunes would soon change. The tremendous gains of the labor unions experienced in the 1930s resulted in part from the pro-union stance of the of the Roosevelt administration. I keep wanting to say President Roosevelt of the Roosevelt administration, and from the legislation enacted by the Congress during the early New Deal. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, in 1933 provided for collective bargaining. The 1935 National Labor Relations Act, I don't think that has an acronym, also known as the Wagner Act, there we go, required businesses to bargain in good faith with any union supported by the majority of their employees. So remember recently, I believe, was it like last year or the year before, Amazon employees were trying to like unionize, and they was like, no unions, or blah, blah, blah. But if Amazon was going to really do the union, they would have to comply by this act that was actually put in by Congress. So here we are. So if you start seeing these companies be like, you know what, I don't know why they don't like union, because they screwed over their employees. The employees see it. They see it. So how do we move on? And so this, what they call this, the CIO. So they say, meanwhile, the Congress of the industrial organizations split from the AFL and became a much more aggressive in organizing unskilled workers who had not been represented before. Strikes of various kinds became important organizing tools of the CIO. Well, this is very interesting, because if you're saying that the CIO is looking for the unskilled workers and the AFL is looking for the skilled workers, then who was really reaching out, like fully educating people about their rights of skills that's necessary to do the jobs, so that they can just focus, like everybody at the end of the day just want to make a fair wage to cover their expenses and their lifestyle. Everybody want to be able to just go home, go to work, do one job, get paid enough in that one job so that they can so they don't have to worry about dealing with all this other stuff. Like nobody wants to work two jobs, but here we are dealing with the unions. Oh man, this is great. Okay. So I was like, all right, why do people even join unions? Why? Just somebody tell me why. So I was actually researching. So I went to LinkedIn, because LinkedIn, LinkedIn does a good job with making sure that people have, a job. So I figured, why not? Let's see what they got to say. And this is by Paul Landahl, project manager of the ADRA. I'm not even sure what that is. But he shows here. He listed a couple reasons why. The first reason is that they want for higher wages and increased benefits, shorter hours, and improved working conditions, and certainly important reasons for joining a union. Secondly, he has on here job security. One basic human need is security. I mean, that's ultimately what I was saying before. It's like we just want to have one job. In a work environment, employees find themselves in dependent relationship with their bosses. Now, this is what a lot of people were saying. So when you hear I'm going off on tangents, it's because I want you to understand that from the financial standpoint, when a lot of people are talking about this FIRE movement, financial independent and retire early movement, they want you to become independent, financially independent from your employer, from your boss, so you can actually fire your boss. This is what the FIRE movement is all about. Because a lot of people don't have that job security or that financial backing, so that they are not, so that most of them are just sitting around being dependent on their work and saying like, hey, I have to go to work or I have to show up to work, or I'll get fired and I don't know what else to do. This is what I'm talking about. So the unions are trying to say that, you know, in the everyday, this is what this person is saying, in the everyday working environment, employees find themselves in a dependent relationship with their bosses and on what they probably view as impersonal organizations. Now y'all be like, well, what is impersonal, Anthony? I don't know. Let's look it up together. Okay. So we can get our definitions. So impersonal is not showing or involving personal feelings. So when people say it's business, not personal, they mean impersonal, not personal. If you learn to look at the root word and all that fun stuff. Okay. So because it's an impersonal organizations, just business, that means that they can fire you and let you go whenever they please to. I know Maryland is a state that it's called an at-will state. Yep. Thank you, Mom. You're so right. Maryland is a work at will state. Yes. Which means that they will fire you at will, no cause or no reason behind it. So know your state laws, double check your state to make sure that you follow that. They also say that they want to know that their jobs will exist in the future and that they will be protected against unfair or arbitrary treatment. Anyway, with the growth of technological change, however, workers feel especially vulnerable to job loss. And this is what I was talking about before. You're going to run into that. So, for example, several thousand robots are now being utilized in manufacturing and continuing the growth expected to use robotics in the near future. So when you're talking about these job replacements, this is what people are afraid of. They are afraid of their job security. So beyond that, keep that in mind. Remember, we talked about as far as the skilled workers versus the non-skilled workers. The CIO is looking for the non-skilled workers, which is almost, I would say, what the new generation is coming. I don't even know what they call themselves now, like Gen Alpha. And this is scary. So will Gen Alpha be part of a union? Will unions be on a rise again to see what's going on? Or will employers start lobbying against some of these laws or acts that are already in Congress to cancel those out? But let's continue on. So obviously they're talking about recognition. I mean, I didn't know unions actually deal with recognition, but they say some employees have found that the union structure offers them the opportunity to gain recognition not available to them in the business organization. For example, a worker with little education may serve on a shop committee or even be elected as a position of influence, such as a steward or office in the local. Now, that is interesting. They do have a seat because I believe when I was a teacher, they made sure at least one of the people that were part of the teacher union were on that panel to make sure that, you know, whatever was discussed was also in light of the teachers and the everyday workers. So I can see that. Participation, many workers have explained that their union membership terms, their desired opposite voice decisions. So back to what I was saying in the workplace. And then also compulsion. Excuse me. So this is another reason why people join unions is social pressure. I mean, come on. What have you done that somebody hasn't recommended to you already? You're more than likely to do something when somebody recommends it and you actually know them and they're your worker and your coworker and so forth. Like, yeah, it's like, why not? It's a no-brainer. So come on. And so I was like, all right, so now I know why people want to join unions. Now I'm like, all right. So they did all this stuff. Were there any like pushback from like because I hear some things about like how in the world did unions start? Or how in the world, like, were there any like pushback for saying like, was it a political game? What were the politics beyond starting unions. So I came across this. They're talking about communism in the union market because I remember one of my coworkers was talking about unions. He was like, "I really hate unions," blah blah blah, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" So this one right here is coming from Oxford. I think this is Oxford. American History. Yeah, so Oxford Research Encyclopedia. So for those of you who are looking at my resources, they were talking about, this is just a quick summary. I am not going to read the whole excerpt research that was done on this. So but this is just a quick summary of what they found. So they said a communist activist took a strong interest in American trade unions from the 1920s through the 1950s. So remember, the first union started in 1890? No, 1795. 1798, I'm sorry. 1798 was the first union has started. We talked about that already. So now they're talking about 1920s and they're talking about the communist movement. Let me move myself out of this way so you guys can see it. Okay. And so they talking about for at least 30 years and played an important role in shaping the nature of the American union movement. Now, keep in mind, during the 1920s through the 1950s, that was also the Great Depression. So does communism have to play in it? I don't know. We're going to continue on reading. They said the initial communist trade union activism drew upon radical labor traditions that preceded the formation of the American Communist Party, the CPUSA. Early communist trade unions experimented with different types of structures to organize unorganized workers. Now, remember, we just talked about this. The CIO is looking at the unskilled workers, and the AFL is looking at the skilled workers. This is intriguing. So they also struggle with the international communist factionalism. Factionalism. Communist trade unions, unionists were the most effective during the Great Depression in World War II. Because remember, we talked about that. That was during the 1930s. In those years, communist activists helped build the Congress institution, which we just talked about, the CIO. What? Mind blown. Okay, I wish I had like an explosion like sound effect. Mind blown. I didn't know that. And during the industrial unionism to previously unorganized workers. Throughout the history of communist involvement in the U.S. labor movement, international communist policy guided general organizing strategies. Shifted in international policy, such as the announcement of the Soviet non-aggression pact in Germany, proved political difficult to navigate on the local level. Yet left-led unions proved to be more democratically run and focus on the racial and gender equality of many of those without the communist influence. So this is good to know that, as far as the left-leaning unions were focusing on, the movement, as we talked about earlier, was the equality of the minorities and also gender equality for everybody in the workforce. Let's see what they also found out here. They say their leadership supported the social justice and militant actions. Interesting. The Cold War years witnessed CIO purge of left union. Ooh, they purged them. Left-led unions and federal investigations and arrested communist trade unionists. Ooh, repression from both within and without the labor movement, as well as the CPUSA's own internal policy battles, ultimately ended communist trade unions' widespread influence on the American trade union. That explains a lot. That is really cool. So let's see. Devana, you say that the union provides health insurance after the worker has retired. Now that is interesting because a lot of unions they do provide some benefits going along the way, um, that a lot of people overlook. And so I was like, all right, so if the Communist Party had a play in this, well, what did the US do in the meantime? But it looked like back then it developed during that whole process of the unionizing of the laborers, the laborers. They came up with the US Department of Labor. So for those of you who are not familiar with the US Department of Labor, they pretty much look up all the stuff that you do about your work. It's like if you want to look for some documentation, some stuff that you want to pull up on your people and be like, hey, what I'm saying, right here in this black and white, this is what it say. So I'm gonna read a little bit of history about this. I'm not gonna go too detailed with it due for time. But man, can you guys believe this is really interesting? So they said the origin of the U.S. Department of Labor. This is coming from the departmentoflabor.gov website. Just talking about the history and how it came about. They say the law creating the U.S. Department of Labor, signed by President William Taft on 1913, was virtually overlooked among the historical events on that day. So the city of Washington was bursting with ongoings of all kinds. It was inauguration day in Woodrow Wilson, and there was usual social whirl that accompanied such an event. In addition, the 62 Congress was still in session on inauguration morning. The retiring president with a pile of bills upon which to act, one of them being the Sulzer bill to create a Department of Labor headed by a cabinet officer. So I'm gonna skip through, give you some timelines here, and just run through the timeline. So Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1869. They say it was the first Massachusetts bureau, started with the voice of labor reformers, which is Henry K. Oliver and George McNeil, who were the bureau's first directors, colored their reports on tenant housing and banks with their own pro-labor views, drawing charges of the businessmen that were too radical, and a partisan struggle soon paralyzed the bureau. Now, this is interesting because there's a book called The Color of Law that talks about how the redlining districts were set up. This could actually be part of that process, because if they're trying to draw in business, you want to mark out where the banks are actually going to invest into those particular towns and cities, which makes really interesting things. Let's see what else they say out here. They say a friend attributed to him the quotation, "Figures won't lie, but liars will figure." His wide-ranging investigations charged the direction of the Bureau's activities and laid the foundation of its reputation for objectivity. By 1883, 12 states had followed Massachusetts. So if you're looking at, 12 states, you're looking at about a time frame from 1869 to 1883. Quick math, you're looking at about 14 years. After 14, a lot of presidents has changed out over that time frame. So, which means that brings us up to 1884, which is the Federal Bureau of Labor. Let's see. With the State Bureau of Labor was established, the labor's strategy for creating a federal labor department had been reshaped. The depressions of 1868 and 1873 had shattered the labor environment, completely destroying, for example, the National Labor Union. In 1874, a meeting of the labor leaders laid aside a resolution for waging a campaign in favor of the National Department of Labor, recognizing their weakened position. These leaders chose a more attainable goal of the Bureau of Labor. So this goes to show that, man, it's a lot of working parts throughout the time that you're actually researching that's going on. So like right now, yeah, that there might be wars going on in other countries. We also have things going on in our cities and towns, and people are constantly moving in these different directions. But who is looking out for you at the end of the day when you go to vote? So when you're thinking about voting, because voting season is this year, I want you to think about, how are they looking out for you as an everyday person? How are they looking out for you in your journey to be, um, getting close to retirement? Or if you have offspring, how are they going to be taken care of? Now, one of the things I did look into is, well, you know, unions. The last thing is that, how much did it cost to join? If you decide to join a union, I'm not telling you to join one. I'm just providing it. The look into, um, you know, what it is that it is offered. Most of them, I think, on average, is about $50 a month, and that's for as long as you're there. Now, they, as we already talked about, they provide you a seat on the table. They providing education. They trying to make sure your voice is heard at the table. They are looking out for your day to day activities, making sure that you're comfortable, and we just want to make sure that they just want to make sure that you have everything that's necessary to be successful in your job, so that you have the job security, you're having the income that's necessary to support your family, and that they are making sure that you know you're happy. At the end of the day, that's all we want, and the corporations aren't taking advantage of you. So, with that being said, if you really enjoyed this episode, make sure you go ahead on and like and subscribe. Share this episode with somebody. I wish you all the best out there. Continue on to learn. If there's any topic that you want me to do a deep dive on, I can do a little bit better research. Please leave that in the comments so I can do some research on that for the next episode. Keep in mind, I have a lot of episodes I need to release. So I think I'm free this weekend. So I'll be just pretty much just start dropping episodes as I'm done. And I'm trying to clear out my backlog. So you got about let's say at least 8 to 10 episodes coming rapid fire. So just make sure you stay locked in, stay tuned. And I wish you all the best, everybody. Y'all be safe. I'm out. Peace.